Hello, everyone, and welcome to Not Just Vibes, how blind players are modding accessibility into games with AI. It's amazing to be back at GAConf for this 2026 EU edition. And in my capacity as moderator, I am SightlessKombat, award-winning multi-credited accessibility consultant and gamer without sight from the UK, as well as being accessible gaming officer for RNIB, that is Royal National Institute of Blind People, and a BAFTA member as well. Now, also in my capacity as moderator of this panel, I am joined by three amazing technical individuals who will guide us through the very interesting topic at hand. And without further ado, I'm just going to start with the introductions, and we're going to start with Aaron.
Hey everyone, I'm Aaron. I work as the AI specialist for a First Amendment free speech nonprofit here in the US. So not at all accessibility related. That being said, I do have an accessibility background because when I was in university, I did work as an accessibility analyst, and I kind of took that experience into the work we're going to talk about today.
Cool. And so, Rashad, why don't you go next?
Hi everyone, I'm Rashad from Saudi Arabia. And unlike Aaron, I have no AI or accessibility experience at all, right? Before January, I'd never even written a line of code in my life. And because of AI now, I write accessibility mods.
Very good ones too.
And part of the reason for the writing of said mods is down to our final panelist, that being Zack. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Zack Kline, and I do have a small background in accessibility. I am a web accessibility person rather than the more technical native apps side. I don't code, however, but I did start this last year by picking a couple of games that were interesting, and it kind of spiraled from there.
And oh, has it spiraled?
Oh, indeed it has. Because to give you the context for why this panel is a thing, there are a multitude, nay, a myriad of mods. And mods is short for modifications, for those who don't know. And it's a concept that's been around for a long time. Mostly, things like graphics or, gameplay or sound design. Any number of things can, in theory, be modded. But over the past year or so, we've seen an absolutely massive number of mods being released to allow gamers without sight, blind gamers, however you want to say it, to experience titles that were previously considered as off limits. So if I were to say names like Disco Elysium, RimWorld, Oxygen Not Included, Final Fantasy 1 to 6. Yeah, that is 6 Final Fantasy games. And that's to name just a few. All of these above examples that I've just given have been created with varying degrees of assistance with AI, and as well as, of course, community collaboration. Now, the main AI that's being used for these mods is none other than Claude Code. Now, I will hand over to Aaron once again, and I will say, could you give an intro to those watching this panel as to Claude Code, what it is, and anything else you want to mention that might be relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So Claude Code is basically what happens when you give something like ChatGPT the ability to do things on your behalf. So a few years ago, we all got ChatGPT, and it kind of took the world by storm. It was really cool and really interesting, but at the end of the day, it was just a chatbot. You sent it messages, and it told you how awesome you were, or maybe it told you the answer to a question you were looking for, and that was it. It was a very, very transactional. You said something, it said something back, and that was it. Well, some very smart people, smarter than any of us here, came up with the idea of, well, let's give something like ChatGPT the ability to use tools. Like humans use tools. We use calculators, we use hammers, we use saws. So why don't we give an AI the equivalent of that? And that's kind of how we ended up with Claude Code. So what Claude Code basically is it's basically a chatbot, just like ChatGPT, except it runs a bunch of tools directly on your computer. So it gives it a lot of power. Like it lets it edit files on your behalf. It lets it open games for you. It lets it write code and test solutions to problems. And it really gives it a lot of agency with which it can then help you with whatever task you're working on. For example, working on accessibility mods like we're doing.
Interesting indeed. And AI, of course, for those who may be unaware, artificial intelligence, hence what we were saying about, giving it tools and setting it to tasks that we might think would be very useful. In this case, making games that we would love to play or be interested in looking at playing playable.
Exactly.
And, handing over neatly from that, looking back at, the last year or so, how did all of this start and what was modding like before AI? And I'm going to start with Zack, and if anyone else wants to kind of chime in as well, feel free to do so.
Well, I can speak to that. Modding was generally something that you did with the help of sighted people who were interested in the projects for its own sake, usually because the amount of specialized knowledge required was kind of intimidating at best for people who are not professional programmers. And even people who are sometimes may not have the deep reverse engineering knowledge or whatever required to make it work.
And also the game knowledge.
And also the game knowledge. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
fair point. But basically, yeah, my understanding, I mean, I've had some experience with mods before this whole AI thing, and there've been some excellent projects done with that, like the mod that makes Crusader Kings 3 playable for us as totally blind players, for example. But that was done by one person dedicating hundreds of hours to one single project out of the goodness of his heart, essentially.
It's something that a blind person could have never done. Sorry to interrupt.
Right. Yeah, pretty much. So.
Yeah, I mean, does anybody else want to offer their thoughts on sort of the previous generation of, or the pre-AI modding scene, I guess?
Yeah, I can say. So I was I don't want to say indirectly. I helped. There back in the day, we had a mod for the original Hades game that I sort of helped with, and one of the interesting things back then was, this whole modding scene was pretty new still, and so the tools with which we had to mod games were very limited. As far like the knowledge we had was very limited, right? Because it was early days for us, for the blind community. But one of the really cool things with a game like Hades is that game already out of the box had a lot of unintentional accessibility features baked in, right? Because everything had a sound. There were tons of sound cues. When a monster used a special ability, you heard it, and it was just so beautifully done, and that made it possible for us to build accessibility onto it. And it just kind of grew up from there.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of hit on this already, but what does it take? What do you need, and what does it mean to make a game accessible? And in the definition of accessibility as we're speaking about it, because there's of course the definition of approachability, but that's a whole separate topic. But what does it mean in this instance to make a game accessible? And anybody can feel free to throw in on this one.
So it kind of depends really on, we're talking about the pre-AI phase looked very different than now the post-AI phase where we have the ability to do much more, right? Pre-AI, I think most of us here would have called something accessible if we could get any enjoyment out of it. And that is to some degree controversial, but I think is an accurate sort of description of how mainstream gaming was viewed among the blind in the pre-AI days. But nowadays, these sort of mods and the access that AI gives us to make them lets us do quite a lot more of like creative ways to represent, inherently very visual games.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think looking at sort of where the AI side of it is now, you need, to make a game accessible can mean, being able to play parts of it, get most of it done, or, in a lot of cases, get all of it done. And that's kind of where the bar has been raised to now, I think. Because before it was, we've got parts of this working we might have, I don't know, we might not have all the things we need, but most of it works. So like Hades, for instance, in its original phase, you had to use a lot of teleportation. You still do, but you might not
you had to
know.
disable the traps as well. It
Yeah,
was
you had to
like,
disable lava. Yep.
and for us, it was amazing. It was incredible. It was one of the coolest things we'd ever gotten to play, even with those, adaptations. And I'm sure, if somebody were to go back and do it now, they would approach it very differently. They would be looking to create a much more pure experience, if you will.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to say
exactly.
agency driven, but yeah, like for instance, you might be able to have audio cues attached to NPCs or like to be able to track. So there was a Hades 2 mod that was added in to the sort of setup that's mostly commonly associated with it now, where you can now track enemies and things, so you can know, okay, there's an object over here, there's an enemy over there, rather than having to just either teleport or randomly connect with it. So things like that can mean making a game accessible, improving on existing experiences, but sometimes you have to start from scratch. And I think that leads well into the next question, really.
So just before you step into that, I do just want to clarify one thing that sort of relates to this, which is the reason why AI has been such a boon to modding. Not only because, people like me who have no coding experience can participate, it's because it lets you sort of just do things that once upon a time took, 4 to 5 weeks of concerted effort in about half an hour.
Exactly.
And then you do them, and then you try them, and you go, this isn't perfect. I know how I could make this better. And then live in the same session while it's still in your brain, you go, okay, I will make this adjustment and this adjustment and this adjustment. And then it feels like a very clean, polished experience. And, I think that people associate AI with, sloppiness and mistakes and such. And it is that. But it is also just capable of iterating and iterating and iterating and iterating and doing something 50 times. And, on the 51st time, it does it right. And those
it's all about being the human
take...
in the loop. That's what I always tell people at work.
Sorry,
I love that expression.
We missed part of that, I think. But...
Oh, sorry. I said it's all about being the human in the loop. That's what I tell people at work all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think in terms of answering fully the question of, or as fully as possible, of the question of what does it mean to make a game accessible, I think the answer before was do what you can within the game's limitations, see what you can get out of it. And I think now the answer might be do what you can with knowledge that's been previously gained, with potentially with the help of AI, and with your own understanding built in, regardless of how much coding knowledge you have.
And even then, there are certain, things that we accept, right? Like I think, Zack, you were recently facing something with, you're working on a project where you had to sort of say, is this relevant or is this not relevant?
Yes. Basically, I'm working on a project to make the 2D mode of Dragon Quest XI, a JRPG, accessible. And I was bashing my head against one particular mechanic. There's a stealth minigame which takes maybe a sighted user 5 minutes to deal with, and as a blind user, it was taking me hours of reverse engineering, and I'm like, is this even worth dealing with? I reserve the right to come back to it later, but basically, I guess the important thing to emphasize is that doing modding requires you to exercise judgment and design and like the ability to think about what matters, what doesn't. That AI is incapable of doing that.
Yeah. And it's also just like, what is the sort of objective of the game, right? Like, is it a story game? Then who cares if you can't do the stealth section? Is it, a combat game? Then probably it's important for the combat to be fun.
Focus on the sort of core pillars of the game's construction is one way of looking at it. But also, of course, there's the school of thought of get things to a basic level so that you can progress to the next thing, get all the systems kind of up and running as you go, and then given you've said I'll go back and do this later, and you're aware of what needs to be sorted out as you're sort of building things along the way, you can then go back and flesh it out later once you know, I can get through it and it kind of works. And then you fix things up and it's like, this is much better now. But that leads on to a really good additional question. I hope you agree with what I've just said there in terms of the idea of fix things as you go along and then come back to it later, given what you've just said as well. I don't know if that's accurate from what you've seen. But I was going to say the next question really kind of relays into this well is what is the hardest conceptual challenge that you've faced? I know, Zack, you've kind of already sort of alluded to the idea of whether you can actually make this work or not, whatever the stealth mechanics or whatever it happens to be. Are there other ones or other ones that anyone else here has faced that you might want to voice here?
Sure. So in RimWorld, there is a schedule screen where it's basically like a calendar. It's like a table, I guess, with all 24 hours. And then a sighted player basically has different brushes, and you paint the schedule. And each brush is like a different job. And so you paint the schedule with a brush at a specific hour to basically say, hey, for this hour or for this range of hours, you should do this task. And this was something that was eating at me for the longest time because I knew there was a solution to this problem. I knew the problem had sort of been solved indirectly in other domains, and it eventually hit me. So what I ended up doing is you use the number keys to select the brush you want, and then in a sort of Excel style way, you can use shift and the arrow keys so you can press space to paint one specific tile of the schedule, but if you want to draw a line, you just hold down the shift key and then use the arrow keys to draw in that direction. And that basically assigns that task to that time. And I think actually after we figured that out, I think Rashad started using that. So it's a very collaborative process. It's really beautiful how collaborative this ends up being.
Yeah, it's really interesting because all of us sort of come up with solutions and then you turn around and suddenly everyone is using them because we all, talk and know each other.
And they all work to varying degrees. And the good thing is it's not like this solution is the perfect, like whatever solution it is the perfect way to do it necessarily. Sometimes it might be. But even if it isn't, then you can evolve from that. It's like, why do you think the Innovation and Accessibility Award exists? Because, we've got innovations happening. So, let's say one game does it one way and then a future game comes along with a similar system and it's like, we'll take this idea, but we'll improve it this way.
There's a tiny amount of pushback that I will offer to that, which is that the user sort of can only hold so many ways to do the same thing in their head at a time.
No, of course.
And so, that is why I think that there has been sort of this shift towards, I wouldn't say a universal design, but sort of like a bunch of standardized, if we've all, for whatever reason, decided like, if you need to use a simulated right click, that's a right bracket. And, I couldn't tell you who came up with that, but we've all sort of just decided that that's how you do things.
A certain amount of bespokeness is kind of inevitable because the games themselves have very different challenges and very different design requirements. But obviously, we try to be at least, semi-predictable within limits. And it's tricky because obviously different games need different experiences and so on.
Well,
and they have different focuses, right?
I was going to say controllers versus versus keyboards is a fun one.
Exactly.
I run into that a lot. I guess if I could answer the question I was asked about, we were asking about the hardest thing that I ran into.
The hardest conceptual challenge that you've faced.
It's tricky, but I found navigating. I think that the Disco Elysium is kind of a tricky example because a lot of it is on the surface pretty straightforward in terms of like, oh, this is a character sheet, these are skills, and this is how it works. It's an RPG, but there's a lot of stuff underneath it that isn't immediately obvious. And this, I think, ties back to the visual nature of some of these games, is that a lot of times something shows up on screen and we don't even know that it's there unless we happen to have the decompiled code handy, or we send a screenshot and someone says, oh, did you know that? And we didn't.
Well, yeah,
Um,
it's like when like tutorial text. I think I remember seeing a comment once about tutorial text, and it was like, did you know this tutorial was there? And it's like, well, no,
No,
I
nobody
Were
told
didn't.
we
me.
supposed to?
Yeah, it's
I
like
think
how am I meant to know when
Yeah.
there's no sound cue for it? It doesn't read anyway. It's
Rashad
yeah,
actually has had a really interesting challenge with this.
Yeah, because I was working on Oxygen Not Included, which is a very sort of screenshot heavy community, right? The wiki is full of screenshots, and when people post about their bases and so on, they share a lot of screenshots. And it's because it's a very visually dense game, and it would take so much time to describe what they're trying to show text, a picture, 1,000 words and all that. But it makes it incredibly challenging as someone who, can't actually look at any of the screenshots to figure out what's going on in the game. And pre-AI, that would have been an immediate, like even if I were, top software engineer of the century, that would have been an immediate blocker. Because like, what are you gonna do? You don't know how the game works. There's no describer. Now you can sort of solve it in the way that you can feed screenshots to AI and it'll give you a somewhat passable description, but it's still, not ideal, right? Like I
No,
do
it's not. Yeah.
wish that communities would be sort of more aware that, we exist, and it would be nice if they described what they were posting so that I knew that it was of some relevance to me at least, and I wasn't looking
I
at
think
80 screenshots to find one.
And you actually got pushback at one point.
Oh, yeah. That was another thing. I went on the Oxygen Not Included server and was like, yeah, I'm working on this mod to do this thing. And someone threw like a very heavily cheated. I had asked for somebody to share a late game save with me to test against. And
yeah,
someone
fair
had
enough.
like shared a really heavily cheated save that was designed to crash. Like it took, I think it was like 11 gigabytes of RAM just to load, and it was not.
And I think people
Yes.
didn't even believe that you were blind.
Oh yeah,
They
no.
figured you
Someone
were
was like, "This is
trolling,
such a
I think, right?
trolly thing," and I was just like, "Why would I troll in this way?" Right? It's sort of
Oof.
there
Wow.
is definitely this sort of lack of awareness among players that we exist.
I think that goes for
Um,
a fair amount of games anyway. But actually,
yes, but sorry, I just want to make the opposite point as well, just to not end on a negative point, which
no, of
is when
course,
I
yeah,
did
yeah,
a different mod against the Storm. I went on their Discord server and everyone was incredibly nice. Two players DM'd me and were like, "Would you like some help working on it?" And it was very sweet. And then the developer themselves reached out and shared a completed save with me so that I'd have something to work with.
See, that's the thing. You've got
So cool.
both kind of ends of the spectrum there, as it were. You've got players who are not just unaware, but seemingly just willing to troll you for what they see as a troll, even though it isn't. And then you've equally got developers sending you useful save files and players being like, "Can we help?" Which is amazing.
Wonderful.
Like that's great
That's
to
really
see.
awesome.
It's always good to see players. When I'm looking around at mods and things as well, or even looking for guides to play existing mods. Like Final Fantasy and things where, I just want to know where I need to go to get to places, for instance, and I easily get lost. I just want to know, where do I go? And it's like, can I find a guide that gives me this information? Thankfully, I will usually be able to find something that helps. So that's always good to
which
see,
is
like, the awareness of content that sometimes just happens to be accessible, but is really useful as well.
If you happen to be, somebody who is watching who is a wiki moderator or is, a game content creator, I think that sort of the takeaway that I would want you to walk away with is that, we also watch your content and would struggle to benefit from it, but could benefit from it much more if
it were
you
made
used
accessible.
alt text tools, which are very easy to use and don't take
Or
a
if you
huge
share
amount of
save
effort.
files, that's a huge one. I mean,
Oh, yes.
when I was, working on RimWorld Access, I've literally watched like 20 hours of YouTube tutorials because I want to make sure that the starting experience for a new blind player is the same as or identical enough to a sighted player. So if blind players watch these YouTube videos, they'll have an idea of what's going on. But there's a lot of this visual stuff like, oh, how do you lay out your base? How do you put your buildings together? And that is very difficult to convey in a spoken word, like in a YouTube video.
Yeah, I mean, or at the very least, traditionally, it might be seen as that. There may be ways to make that work. But
Yeah,
sorry,
and
yeah.
Aaron's idea of the save file is the sort of way that you can sort of get across
Yeah.
that. Because it's
That's-
already stuff that you have. It doesn't take a significant amount of effort to just include it.
I mean, I'm going to move on to the next sort of related question here. We've kind of answered, part of it, I guess. But have there been any worrying trends, as this space has evolved? Have there been any trends that you're just concerned about that you want to highlight here?
We've definitely touched on one of them earlier on when Aaron said, be the human in the loop. Pre-AI, creating a mod was this really sort of grueling, it could take a year, right? And that's sort of evidenced by the fact that pre-AI, there's maybe 5 or 6 accessibility mods for mainstream games. And now post-AI, there's 50.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not exaggerating, by the way, that's probably a real number.
There are a lot. There are a
But
heck
the
of a
reason
lot.
I say that is that, pre-AI, that whole, it's going to take me a year, really weeded out a lot of unserious attempts. And, now you sort of get to the point where Claude code is downloadable by anybody, and anybody with, $100 to spare and a will can just take a shot at it and release it to the public.
Something in 10 minutes.
Exactly. And like whether or not it's good is now 100% dependent on whether or not they're willing to stick at it. And there's no way as, an end user to figure out how much time did they actually put into this? Does it work the way I would expect it to? You just sort of have to trust the author's word with no way to verify for yourself other than reputation.
Yeah.
And obviously the problem is that, like I said earlier, this requires design thinking and it requires a skill set that the AI cannot provide. The AI can give you all sorts of information, but it can't substitute for good judgment. And I think that a lot of times maybe people think, oh, I'll make an accessibility mod, and they don't realize what that actually means is that they will spend a lot of time thinking about questions that are not like programming questions, but that are like design questions.
They're game design questions.
Yeah.
You're building a game within a game.
Right.
Yeah,
Or you're
exactly.
coming up with like a representation. How do I represent this? What do I say? And honestly, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to maintain mods because not only through game updates, which are a whole other thing, but just in general, because you'll always find, oh, I can refine this. But it's easy to be like, oh, I want to release something. And then once it's released, to realize that, oh, this is actually a lot more effort and frustration than I anticipated. And that's fine. It's not for everyone, but it does lean heavily into the problem of like quote unquote slop, because it's like, okay, maybe if it isn't for you, then don't release it until it's in a state that, you'd be happy to play through yourself.
Yeah, my start was kind of funny because I started playing RimWorld when the original builder of RimWorld Access named Shane, when he put it on GitHub, I thought, I'll just make like 1 or 2 code contributions and call it a day. I don't really want to get invested in this. And next thing I knew, I was spending like 8 to 10 hours a day, even on work days, right? I'd work, I'd have an 8-hour work day, and then I'd leave work and spend another 6 hours working on the RimWorld mod for, I've been doing it for months. Like it's a lot of fun. But one thing I'd like to tell people is as fun as this is for us doing this, it's very unsustainable long term.
It's unsustainable because also all of this work that we do breaks immediately often the second the game is updated.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like they update it. Not even sometimes if things have changed, but if like even if just a version, like it might be ever so slightly different.
Yeah. For the coders out there, it's we use a lot of reflection. We use a lot of harmony patching. If the field names change behind the scenes, everything
falls apart. Yep.
And it's so difficult to sort of diagnose that kind of thing because like, are you going to realistically expect that a developer play through the entire game on every single update? We're doing this in our own free personal time.
Yeah.
And suddenly you find that you've been signed up to full-time debug multiple games, and it becomes quite intense. I think that even though it is incredibly empowering that we can bring this experience to ourselves and to our community, it is kind of unfortunate
that we have
to be the ones doing it.
the ones doing it. Yeah.
I mean, because of course, you know, there are so many people who want to play these games. There are people who, I mean, there's clearly interest there, because otherwise these mods wouldn't be being created in the first place. You know, there is a massive amount of knowledge there. You know, there's all sorts of stuff, and the key thing is native accessibility is just so, like, if people want to buy a game and just play it, there are barriers there to even installing these mods. Sometimes you can install a mod and say your antivirus might block it because it thinks it's trying to do things that antivirus would do, even though
it's not even just that. It's that every single mod has its own little quirks and install paths and
Yep.
yeah.
And then once you
like,
have them installed, they all have their own keyboard shortcuts, and they all have.
And then you have to remember to update them, because you can't necessarily have them updated.
Because some people like me and Rashad update our mods like every day.
Every day,
it's a lot.
It's a whole thing.
Not just for the modders, but for the players too.
For the players as well.
But I think that we're maybe giving the overly negative impression here that this is so much work, and it is. But I think that it's important to remember that the reason we play these, or the reason we do this, is because we want to play these games.
And we love these games.
And we love these games, yeah.
It's very,
like, we're willing to do this work because we're so excited at the prospect of playing games that you know, we'd often, like, I have wanted to play RimWorld since it first came out.
Me too.
And like, I remember the first time that Shane, the guy who originally posted on it, and this was before I had started modding myself, and he was like, I'm making a mod for this. I remember I dropped everything and just went, this is the coolest feeling in the world. Because, you know, you watch people you you care about play these games, and like you get excited to wanting to share the experience with. Like, gaming is a very social hobby, and you know, especially in our generation, it is a huge part of the culture. And for a very long time, you know, we were left out of that culture. So to be, one, able to participate in the culture, and two, able to bring it to other people, it is a really, really nice feeling.
It's rewarding.
Yesterday, someone texted me and was like, I have always wanted to play Oxygen Not Included. I've put in like 400 hours. This is the perfect game for me. Thank you so much. And I was just like, I couldn't stop smiling all day, because like it's such a beautiful feeling.
Yeah. It's very amazing.
And that's the thing, there's all this untapped potential, and I think that's gonna take us into our final question for the panel, really, or our final main question. And you've kind of already sort of looked towards it, I guess, for lack of a better description. What are you most excited for in the future of this space? What would you say you're most excited for? Other than, of course, making people, including yourselves, smile at the thought of other people putting hundreds and hundreds of hours into a project you've worked on.
So one of the things I've been most excited for, I think, I know Rashad would agree with me, is it actually happened while we were preparing this panel, which was Slay the Spire 2 came out, which
with 600,000 concurrent users on Steam. It was like a huge release.
Yeah, whatever it was a big number. Yeah,
it was massive.
4 days after the game came out, the guy that was modding the original Slay the Spire released like a beta version of his mod for Slay the Spire 2. So
when he modded, I was gonna say, when he modded the original Slay the Spire, for context, it took him a year.
Yeah, and it was pre-AI, and it
was pre-AI. He did it by hand when it was first released. It took him a year.
And this was
he did this in 4 days.
We were able to play the game the week it came out. That is almost unheard of for
I can't
most
think of
games
a
of this.
Single time that it has ever happened with a game at that scale.
Short of like, I mean, something like
native.
Last of Us.
Maybe The Last of Us 2 is the only sort of comparable.
Like, sort of,
but like, that's it.
For the majority of mainstream games, I think is what we're saying.
Yeah.
That it is unheard of. And the fact that I joined in on that, because I had the original Slay the Spire, I played a fair amount of that. It's not usually my kind of game, but I enjoy the atmosphere, the vibe, the ridiculous damage numbers when you can get those to happen. Combinations of cards, and you're like, "Ooh, that enemy's just gone completely out of existence. That's great. One less problem." That kind of thing. Those moments of, "Yay, I did it!" Being able to dive in, buy the game on a cheaper price because I had already owned the original as well, and be like, "I can go."
I forgot they did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, I can go and test
very
this
nice of
mod.
that. I got credit.
I can go and test this mod and be like, yeah, this is great. And yes, there'll be holes, there'll be bugs, there'll be
But it's
They're the same bugs
you
everyone
can
else
play
is.
it. I can play the game. I can go into work the next morning and talk to my gamer coworkers and be like, "Hey, I made it to the Act 1 boss last night on my first run. What did you like?" That social experience is so
they're
beautiful.
still talking about it. I'm so used to getting to play a game 4 years after everyone's moved on, right?
Yep.
And then I'll be like, "Yeah, I'm finally," and they're like, "Oh yeah, let me try and remember what that was like." And
exactly.
now we are
People's
part
eyes
of
just
the
kind of glaze
cultural
over.
zeitgeist.
Yep, they glaze over. They're like, I don't really remember this anymore. Yeah.
No, exactly. Or they're like, oh, I'm sure that was really hard to get through or whatever. But the fact that we are all able to talk about it within not even a week of release, and the fact that, yes, the mod's having to be updated, but we are playing alongside the early access things, commenting on stuff where people are like, oh, this card's broken, and we're like, yeah, we know.
Yeah, we agree.
It's a great shared
is broken, and it was
cultural touch point.
and like I think this isn't the first time that AI has sort of revolutionized digital accessibility. A couple years ago, suddenly we were all able to look at screenshots, which was also quite
That
huge.
was amazing too.
And I don't think it'll be the last time that it revolutionizes digital accessibility. Like I think as much as AI has, interesting and horrifying side effects.
It is a divisive topic.
Yes, let's just leave it there. As much as it is a divisive topic, I think that it has generally,
in this instance,
leveled the playing field quite a bit digitally for the blind.
Yeah.
And it's got interesting conversations started because don't forget, these mods have innovations in that you could utilize as a part of your own development with native accessibility. So let's say you're not sure of how could I do a scanner for a story-based narrative adventure or whatever it happens to be. Like let's say a person's making a turn-based RPG or a colony management game or something like that. Any number of other things, or a deck builder. We have now these sometimes refined versions of existing setups that you can now go through and be like, oh, I see how this works. And those didn't exist before necessarily, other than
it's kind of like case law for accessibility.
It is literally, that is exactly what I was going to say. It is also, I think, very difficult if you are a sighted person to sort of envision. Again, I'll use Oxygen Not Included because I worked on it. Right? It uses colors for everything. Right? It highlights different parts of the map in different colors, and like we had to figure out ways to do that. And some of them are auditory, and some of them are speech, and it's the kind of thing that I think like a sighted person without serious experience of what it is like to use assistive technology would have really struggled to envision. But because, it's our lived experience, it is quite sort of intuitive
yeah.
for us to come up with these designs. And, now we are able to sort of put those designs out into the world, and maybe, hopefully, that is of some benefit to those working in the mainstream towards accessibility.
Right, because as we said before, we are not able to or interested in doing this kind of work sustainable.
Indefinitely.
Indefinitely.
It's not sustainable, and it's
there will be a point where we don't want to be responsible endlessly for the same game 5 years down the road.
We don't want to have to be stewards of these titles when let's say a remaster of a game comes out that's already been modded and it adds a bunch of stuff in, like cool content or whatever.
Then, or like, what if you do a yearly one like the Football Manager games, which I was looking into? You're just going to keep doing it every year? Oh, God.
There's so many things where it's like there are games that we would love to play, but the barrier to even modding these for whatever reason, there are multiple reasons as to why there'd be barriers, whether that's yearly release cycles, whether that's the fact that modding these games is sometimes extremely difficult anyway for whether that's engines, whether that's how the systems are put together, all sorts of reasons that can come into it. But the fact of the matter is that people don't want to have to be toiling away at these games just to make it even function. What we would love to do instead is just sit down, play these games day one with everybody else, with accessibility being baked in from the start thanks to feedback
That would be a
from
dream.
all of these
It would be
knowledgeable
amazing.
people, consultants like myself and everybody else, but people who've also worked on these mods, because you need multiple perspectives, multiple valuable, insightful perspectives like that from all across the player base, from casual to, devotedly hardcore players of your games, to make accessibility as robust and useful as possible. And I think that's the dream that we all share. I'm not trying to speak for everybody here, but I think we would all agree.
Oh, I think we
with what you just
100%
said.
agree with you.
100%.
Yeah, agreed.
1000%.
Yes.
Yeah,
So thank you all for the opportunity to participate in this.
Yeah, it was wonderful to get to
Absolutely.
share these views with you guys.
Yeah, I mean, with that though, we can end off. I mean, given these AI discussions are going to be happening for a while to come, I think, as people discover what can be modded, what can't be modded, what they want to mod, what other people might want to have modded. There's been discussions happening of all sorts of iconic games as of recently, some of which
And
I'm
if-
playing at the moment, which are
Yeah.
amazing.
And if you're interested in those discussions, the three of us, after meeting for this panel, now have a podcast.
And this is what I was just going to ask as the final question. Well done. Where can people find you if they want to have further discussions of this? Feel free to plug your socials, etc. And of course, the podcast as well.
I don't have any socials to
Yeah, I
plug.
don't really have any
Remember.
socials either. I mean, I might
Yeah.
set something up. But our podcast, which as Rashad was saying, it's called To Slop
To
or Not to
slop or
Slop.
not to slop.
It's very informal. We just talk about AI stuff, sometimes gaming stuff. We haven't technically published the first episode at the time of this recording, but by the
But
time
it will be,
by the time the live panel happens, the recording will be there.
and there will be multiple episodes.
Yes.
Yes.
So-
That's great to hear. That'll be interesting to see how that all transpires. And I'm sure as part of the description for the talk or whatever, there could be links to other resources as well, potentially, to if any other things come up
We'll arrange that. It's fine.
Yeah, definitely.
afterwards, if we have any other ideas post call as well, post recording. Yeah, sorry, was anyone else going to say anything, or
Nope.
just okay? Yeah, in which case then we will leave this panel here. If you want to find me, I will, well, actually, much like the rest of the panelists, I think, I will be in the Discord. I will have attempted to be answering the questions to my past self.
Yeah, I think we'll all be there
Oh,
doing
yes,
that.
we will all be on the
Of course.
Discord,
We'll all be
hopefully having already answered your questions.
We're trying our best to do so at the very least. But if you want to find me, you can find me as SightlessKombat, SightlessKombat, on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, Blue Sky, all those kinds of places. And of course, you can find me at www.sightlesskombat.com as well. If you want to know what RNIB are doing, and if you want to send inquiries there, you can send gaming@rnib.org.uk an email, or you can, of course, type in RNIB DFEG in your search engine of choice too. But I want to thank everybody at GAConf for organising this great opportunity. It's been an honour to be a part of this panel. And here's to the rest of what is hopefully a fantastic conference. Thank you very much for watching.
Yes, thank you.